Business People, welcome Yuka Royer to the studio, our business editor. The war in Iran already slowing down the global economy. The International Monetary Fund has downgraded its economic outlook, warning of the risk of a recession.
Well, Mark, given the huge uncertainty we're facing right now, the IMF gave a new outlook under 3 different scenarios, one that assumes the conflict to be short-lived and 2 others that are worse. Even if the war ends relatively quickly, global GDP growth is expected to slow down. But the world may already be drifting towards the second adverse scenario of much weaker growth and higher inflation. And in a more severe case, where the war continues well into next year, with oil prices averaging above $100 a barrel, the risk of a global recession would be a close call, according to the IMF. Now, the current crisis is affecting everyone on the planet, but unevenly. The United Nations Development Programme is warning that more than 32 million people across the world could fall into poverty by a triple shock of energy disruption, food price increases and weaker economic growth. Now, for more about the agency's findings, let's cross now to Washington, D.C. to speak with UNDP's administrator and former Belgian Prime Minister, Alexander de Croo. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Hello, good to have you.
Now, could you tell us more about just what kind of economic reality people in the poorest and most vulnerable countries are facing? Is the war dialing back the clock in global development?
Exactly. What we see is that war is development in reverse. And so after decades of steady progress and of drastically reducing poverty throughout the world, drastically improving on other metrics such as child mortality, we now see that even if this war would stop right now, there is already now a risk that 32 million people would be pushed back into poverty. And it is being pushed back because these are very often people that were recently lifted out of poverty. And so what we see is that progress takes decades. Wiping that out takes just six weeks of war.
Yeah, just 6 weeks of war. So you're telling us that 32 million people pushed into poverty. That's a conservative figure. It's provided that the war doesn't continue well into next year. So what would happen if it were to be a long war?
We have not made that analysis because we don't want to be necessarily the Cassandras and only focusing on the negative part. What we have done as an analysis is what needs to happen now. Of course, ending the war would be priority number 1, but next to that, you will also need a policy response, and that policy response is urgent to do it right now, is to make sure that what is happening now is a negative blip, is an acute problem and is not a lasting problem. And to us, there are 2 measures that we see that are very effective. Is first of all, in those countries that are very dependent on import of fossil fuel and who do not have a lot of fiscal space, is cash transfers. Cash transfers which should be temporary and focused on those parts of the population that are most in need. That is by far the preferred option, and that has been tested during the COVID period and was very effective. Another method of working is to subsidize fossil fuels or create packages of energy that would be reduced in prices. But it is crucial that intervention happens now. If not, you will start seeing ripple effects in other domains. Ripple effects in food insecurity, in increases in migration, in other types of conflicts which might happen because of the potential of food shortage. Another calculation shows that there are 45 million people in risk of acute food insecurity, and that would be an additional effect which would be quite dramatic.
Dramatic indeed. The UNDP's report, though, is cautioning against blanket energy subsidies. Why is that a bad idea?
That's a bad idea because, first of all, you have big spillover effects, and that would be a very costly measure that would be giving handouts to people who are not necessarily in need for doing so. And our calculation would be that that would have inflationary increases in inflation effect, which are to be avoided. I mean, the statistics that you just showed of the severe scenario would have a reduction of the economic growth throughout the world to approximately 2% and much higher inflation could push the world into a stagflation situation, which we all know is extremely difficult to get out of.
And what kind of global cooperation is needed, do you think, given that many of these developing countries are struggling with high levels of debt? Do you think that the private sector needs to get involved as well?
Well, I think the interventions on the tailored targeted interventions that we talked about, that really needs to happen at the level of international financial institutions, such as African Development Bank, World Bank, or even IMF in some cases. To do that well, you need institutions of that size, and these are sound investments. There is an economic payout of avoiding to push such a large group of people into poverty, and the cost of non-action obviously is much higher. Now, can the private sector play a role? Yes, it can in, for example, accelerating the energy transition. We see today that the combination of solar panels with batteries, so with storage, is today already in many places cheaper than fossil fuel. So accelerating that transition makes business sense and also leads to less dependence on the situation that we see today.
Indeed, the cost of inaction would be much higher than the cost of action. Well, Alexander de Croo, UNDP Administrator, thank you so much.
My pleasure.